So yesterday we looked at unit testing, test-driven development, and unit testing is typically used for testing the domain classes, the business logic. Today we're going to look at acceptance testing and then testing a web interface. So basically a web page, what you do from the browser, normally you send an HTTP request and you get an HTTP response back, and that's normally shown in a browser. That's what we want to test. And there are different ways to do that. One is we write Java code. That's with Selenium WebDriver. That's the topic for today. What you also can do is record, play and replay. And I will just give a demo. We do a very small exercise so you get an idea. But typically what you want to do is use Selenium WebDriver. So the difference, if you do record replay, it's easy to do. But these tests that you make, they're very fragile, hard to maintain. Let me give an example here. One tool to do that is Catalan. Catalan, and you have also Selenium IDE. These are tools to record mouse clicks and keyboards whenever you type something, to register that and to repeat that. Let me give an example. So what I have here is I have on the left side my browser. It's just a calculator. And on the right side here I have the Catalan recorder. Now, here is my record button, so let's see what happens. So I press the record button, so it's recording now. And now I'm going to use my calculator. So what I do, the first thing I do, I press the 3 button here. So what you see now in the recorder is first we get a command open, go to this website, to this URL, and click name is 3. I will go deeper into this, but this is a locator. So a web application, there are in this calculator page, there are a lot of buttons in there and fields. So all these buttons and fields, you need to locate them so that you can do something with them. So here I have the command click, but click of what? I need to tell what do you need to click? What do you want to click? Well, here the target name is 3, that's a locator. You have locator by ID, there is a locator by name, you have a locator by CSS locator, you have a locator by XPath. So there are different locators. We'll come back to that. So I click the 3, then I click the plus. So you see here, click name is add. Then I click, for example, 9. And I click the equal button. So if you look here, the commands, go to this URL, click 3, click add, click 9, click equal. And now I want to test, that's my test, that this field here has the value 12. I cannot record that because I have to specify it myself. Every time you want to check something, you have to type it in these commands, this script, basically your test script, you type it in yourself. So let's do that. So now I can stop the recording and I can say here, add a command, basically this command. What command do I want? So I type it in here. So that's verify value. That's what I want to do. Then the target, which field do I want to verify the value from? Well, this button here helps me to find that element. So if I click this one, and then when I go here, whenever I come somewhere, this becomes yellow, and I want this field. So if I click here, it knows, well, it's name equal text. That's the locator of this field. And the value, well, it should be 12. So you see here now, this is my script. Go to this URL, click 3, click add, click 9, click equal, and then check, verify that the value in the field with name is text is equal to 12. And now I can play this script. So I play it, and then you see on the left side, it fills it in. So that went pretty quick, so I can slow this down a little bit. So go a little bit slower. Run it again. You say 3 plus 9 is 12. And everything is green. Now let's say I do something different. So I make a mistake or so. So instead of 12, I have 11. And I run it again. Then 3 plus 9. And then you see it is red here. And then here in my output, I should be able to see here, did not match. There's an error. It also makes a screenshot. And I see in the screenshot it was 12. And I got 11 here. And I can add new commands. I can record more tests. I can create a suite of tests. But this is basically what you do if you do record and replay. Now, the difficulty with this is, first of all, it is possible, but it is very hard to make loops in here. You want to do something in a loop or an if then else. It is possible, but it is much harder than if you would do it in Java. Also, you see that if I record this and let's say they change something on the calculator, depending on what they change, it might be that I have to update all my tests. So similar as yesterday with the unit tests, you have a lot of these tests for just one web page. Maybe we have 30 tests for this calculator, maybe more, maybe 100 tests. And then we change something in the calculator. Then it might be that I have to either record or change all these 100 tests. That's the disadvantage of using this approach. So what we want to do is Selenium WebDriver. So here it is hard to do more complex testing with loops and conditional logic, hard to reuse test scripts, and it is hard to have a data-driven test. For example, you want to put all the data in a property file or an Excel spreadsheet or something, and then repeat this test. So now we did 3 plus 9 is 12. And I also want to do 0 plus 0 should be 0. I also want to do maybe 1,000,000 plus 10 million should be 11 million. That's only for the add. I also want to do that for subtract. What I basically want is that I make a data-driven test. That I have somewhere specified the data, and that the data decides which buttons that I'm going to click. It's very hard to do this way. Now, writing tests takes more time. You have to write Java code instead of recording. But it's easy to maintain. That's the big advantage, and that's actually why this is the best practice. You write it in Java. You can do more complex testing. You can reuse these test scripts. That's why we're going to look at Selenium WebDriver. So to talk to a browser, you need a driver, a web driver. And there are many web drivers for Firefox, Chrome, for all these popular browsers. There is a web driver that you can use. We will use the Chrome web driver because that's the easiest one to use. Now, here's an example of the Java code that you use to write a web test, a web page test in Java using Selenium WebDriver. The first thing you need to do is tell Selenium WebDriver is just a framework. You have to tell where it can find the WebDriver. So I'll explain that in the exercise when we do this, but Chrome, for example, we get a new version so many months. Few times a year we get a new version. For every version, for most of the versions, there is a separate WebDriver. They change something in Chrome and then the WebDriver has to change. So what's the WebDriver? It's just a driver to talk to Chrome. So the first thing I need to do, you have to look up your Chrome version on your computer and you have to download the WebDriver for that version. And you have to put that WebDriver somewhere. So I put it in my example in ctemp chrome driver.exe. So this is for Windows, so there's a chrome driver.exe that I put in ctemp. And here I say system set properties WebDriver Chrome driver is ctemp chrome driver.exe. This is to tell Selenium WebDriver, this is where you find the Chrome driver, because it's going to use that Chrome driver to talk to my Chrome browser. Then what I do, I create a new Chrome driver. Then I say driver.navigate to http google.com. So basically what I do in my test, similar as if I recorded, but now I write the code, I have to tell in my test what am I going to do on a web page. So the first thing is go to this URL, open this web page. So what will it do in that line? It will open google.com. It will start up Chrome and open google.com. Then I'm going to get a web element. So all the buttons, all the text fields, all the hyperlinks, all the pull down menus, whatever it is on a web page is a web element. So what I want to do in the search field of Google, I want to type in here the text dogs. That's what I want to do in this test. Now, before I can do that, I first have to get the web element of that search field where I can type in my search query. Well, in Google, that query has that field has a name, and the name is Q. That's how Google built that page. So what I do, I say driver.findElement by name Q. That's similar in Catalan. There was also which button do I need to click? So I say click, and say name equal 3 or 9 or equal. That's a similar, that's a locator. Call it a locator. I've come to that. So the locator for the field, the search field in google.com is called Q. So driver.findElement by name Q returns that query field where you can type in your search query. And then I say query field.setKeys dogs. Oh, sorry, send keys. Basically send the text dogs to this field. If you look in it, if you run this test, you see the browser comes up, you see the text field, you see dogs is filled in. And then I say query field.submit. So submit is basically That's basically your your enter. You type in Google, you type in, you say enter, and then you get the result. That's the submit. And then what you get is you get the next page, the search result of you type in dogs. Well, then I can do my assertions, my verify, here I have my assert that. So assert that, what I can do is driver.getCurrentURL. So I can ask the web page, that's my result page, get the URL. And then I have here a matcher called contain string dogs. So that's all that I do in my test, that I go to the Google web page, I type in dogs, I press enter, and I check that the URL, it should contain dogs. That's my test. And then I say driver.quit, and that basically closes down my, my browser. So it's similar as a unit test. The only difference is we don't talk to a Java class, but we talk to an API, the Selenium WebDriver API, that talks to a browser. And then we get everything we do is with driver, driver.navigate, driver.findElement. And then we have an element, we say send keys, driver.getCurrentURL. That's how, and then driver.quit. That's how a test looks like in Selenium WebDriver. So there are two ways to go to a certain URL. Driver.get, you specify the URL, or driver.navigate to. Does exactly the same thing. Typically use get that it's smaller. Then we have to find elements. And in my example I had driver.findElement by name Q. Find element by name Q. And these find elements, you can find them in different ways depending on how your website, your web page is structured. How does the implementation of your web page look like? So we're going to look at element locators. That's how you find elements on a web page. And there are many of them. You have find by ID, find by class name, find by name, that's what we used in our example, find by tag name, find by CSS selector, find by link, find by XPath. That are your options. Now, maybe you've never looked at web pages or never built a web page or whatever, but typically elements, you have to, if you write them, they have a tag. You can give them a name, you can give them an ID. So here's an example. I have here this input field here. This is how it looks like in HTML. So it has an input tag and I give it an ID. That's the best practice for web pages. Give every element on your web page an ID. And an ID is always unique for every element on a web page. So here, ID is email. Well, what I can do now is driver find element by ID email. Give me the web element with ID email. And that field that I get back here is exactly this email or phone field. This, if an element has an ID, you should always use by ID. Why? Because let's say I move this text field somewhere on a different location in my web page, maybe at the bottom of the page instead of the top of the page. Then the ID remains the same. So my code that I write in my test still will work. independent of where that text field is, that input field, because the ID remains the same. Now, if you don't have an ID or a name, I will show some other options later, you have to go by the location of that field on your web page. Now, if that location changes, all your tests that use that location have to change also. You don't have that with an ID. So that's the best practice. And here you see that maybe yesterday we saw good design goes hand in hand with easy to test. If something is easy to test, it's not typically have a good design. Well, if you want to test a web pages and you want to do it in a good way, you have to make sure that all elements on the page have an ID. So you have to make sure in your project, the people that make the web pages, they put an ID on every web page, a unique ID. Now you have to be careful also with ID. There are frameworks. Java Server Faces is such a framework. So there's a lot of web frameworks. One of them is Java Server Faces. And if in Java Server Face the programmer doesn't specify an ID, then the framework creates an ID dynamically for you. But these are dynamic IDs. They change over time. So you have to be careful. Let's say you have to test a web page and that framework that creates the web pages uses dynamic IDs and you use ID on your test, then the next time you run a test it will not work anymore because on your web page you get different IDs. And you run it after that again, you get again different IDs. So you want IDs that are stable and are unique within the page. That's by ID. You can also have a name. So you can have fields that have a name. So here you see this input field. Input, type is text, size is 10, name is username. And then I can say find element by name username. A name doesn't need to be unique. An ID should be unique. Name doesn't need to be. And so that's why it's better to use ID. But if you don't have an ID, then a name is better. But then you have to look, is this name really unique on the web page? That's by name. So here I have an example. This is my HTML here. So I have here a form with an input field, and this input field has an ID. Actually, this input field also has an ID. And then here is my button that does not have an ID. I have here also a class. So this one, class name, that's this one. So some also have a class. Class is name, class is email, class is button large. And so here I say driver find element by ID name. Driver find element by class name with name. That's the same input field here. Driver find element by ID email. That's this one, that's this input field. So that's locators with ID and name. And there are much more. I skipped this one for a moment. So we have driver find element. What does it do? Let's say that ID or name or whatever matcher it is, it doesn't match any control on your web page, then it throws an exception. That is, find element will throw an exception. If there is one match, it returns that web element. If there are two or more, it returns the first element it finds. So the DOM is basically the tree structure of your web page. So let's say you do find element by name, and there are 3 buttons with that name. Then the first button it finds with that name, it returns that one, not the other 2. You also have find elements. So then you get a list of web elements back. Well, if there is no matches, you get an empty list. If there is one match, you have a list with one element. And if there are two or more, they are all put in the list. So find element and find elements. And so here I have, for example, driver find elements by tag name A. Well, there are two tags here with tag name A. This one and this one. So these two elements have both tag name A. So then what I do is I do here assert equals links.size should be 2. So I check if it's 2 and I print out here the reference attribute of that link. That's this one here, this one and that one. That's what I print out. So basically what you see here is that what is Selenium WebDriver? It's an API to do normally everything you can do as a human on a web page, you can do in code. Click here, get the attribute of this tag, find the element with this ID, send keys, so fill in this text, click this button, verify that this field has this text. That's what you do. Now another locator is a CSS selector. So what's CSS? Cascading Style Sheets. It's an technique that separates the data on a web page with the makeup of your web page. The colors and the fonts and all these kind of things. So you can separate that so that the look and feel, basically, what you do in your cascading style sheets, you can reuse that on every page instead of copy paste that in every page. And to do that in cascading style sheets, if you want to make some fields, the background color red, for example, you have to specify which field. So in CSS, they also have locators. And one of the locators here, what you can do is a tag and ID. So this field here, the tag is input and the ID is email. So here I say find by element by CSS selector, and then the way I specify that in CSS is I first have the tag, then the pound sign, and then the ID. So if I want to do that, so normally this case you hardly use, because as long as every element on the page has a unique ID, you don't need the tag name. But let's say there are the same IDs or whatever, and here you can say the tag name should be input and the ID should be email. That's input pound email. What you also can do is tag and class name. So the tag is input, the class name is input text, and then it's a dot. So by CSS selector, tag name input, dot, class name input text. What you also can do is tag and attribute. So here the tag is input, the tag is input, and it has an attribute, name is last name, or size equal 20, max length equals 60. So what I say here now, I have an input, and then between these square brackets, I put my attribute, name equal last name. That's another way to locate a web element. That's the tricky part. How can I locate the web elements? So here there's a lot of CSS selectors. Here is just the tag. Here is the name. Here is the pound sign, that is the ID. The dot, that was the class. Here you have input with ID first name, input with class, my form, all kind of locators. Here there are more, all kind of locators. Now, how do I find these locators? Well, do I have to know CSS selectors? What you can do, so let me show that here. So I go back to this web page here. And what I can do is, let's say this button with the value 6. I want to know what is the locator of this button. So what I can do is I do right click and I say inspect. And then I get this. So let's make this a little bit larger here. So what I see now is that this one is highlighted. That was that button. So I see it's an input, type is button, name is 6, value is 6, and then all kind of other things. Well, the locator in this case would be, the easiest locator is name. Name is 6. That's a locator I can use. But what I can also do, if I want a CSS selector, and then most of the time you get complex CSS selectors, but if I right click this and I say copy, and then I can say copy, where is it? Selector, this one. Copy selector, that's the CSS selector. So I copy it, and if I paste this now in Notepad, this is the CSS selector, the complex CSS selector for this field. And then I can look at, well, I have many input type buttons, so that's the one I cannot use. So that's why it's a complex. So that's something you can do. This is a CSS selector. Something I want to show that now. So the next thing we're going to look at is we also have an XPath selector. What is XPath? XPath is a query language for XML, and a web page is XML. So you can use a CSS selector, you can also use an XPath selector, and some CSS selectors and all XPath selectors, they deal with the location. Where is the location of this button 6? So what I can do here is I can also copy XPath here. So I copy XPath, go to Notepad, and let's put it under here. What's my XPath? This is my XPath. You see that looks pretty complex. You don't want to write this yourself. It's easy to make mistakes, but you want to let the browser generate that for you. XPath selector. So we are not going to go deeply in complex CSS selectors, complex XPath selectors. We introduce what is XPath, what is CSS selectors, and that's it, and we use the browser to find them. Another thing we could do is use, for example, Catalan. So let's close this inspect here. So we go back to Catalan. Over here. Let's say I want another field. So I say I want another command here. And it should also be verify value. But then let's say I want this field here. So what I can do is click this one, go here, this is the field I want, and it chooses for me the most option, the best selector here, which is name is B. That's my selector. But I can also choose here other selectors. So here you see a CSS selector, input with the attribute name is B. Here, these two are XPath selectors. Actually, this is also an XPath selector. This is a CSS selector. So you see, Catalan also helps me to make selectors. So XPath is a query language, the same as SQL is for databases, is XPath for XML. And it works with these slashes. If you know Unix, for example, or in Windows the DOS prompt, then typically you work with slashes when you go to a different directory. Where in Unix or in DOS you have cd, change directory, slash, var slash, and then subdirectory slash subdirectory. That's the same how XPath works. Again, we're not going too deeply into it, but here's an example. If this is my XML file here, a bookstore with 2 books, if I say slash bookstore slash book, what this will return is all the elements book in the bookstore. So that's this element and this element. Here I have an XPath slash slash add lang. So the add sign deals with attributes. So here you say, give me all attributes lang. And that's what it returns. That is this one, lang is English, and this one, lang is English. Here I specify with slash slash, give me all the books. And then you get back 2 books. And then you can put predicates on it. So here, for example, give me the first book, give me the last book, give me the last but one book, give me the first 2 books here, give me all the books that have attribute lang is English, give me all the books with a price bigger than 35, give me all the titles of all the books, price bigger than 35. So you see, there's a certain way how XPath works. We're not going to learn all the details of XPath. If we use XPath, we just copy it. We let the browser generate our XPath expression. Now, why would I use XPath if I have an ID or a name? Well, if you have an ID or a name, you should not use XPath. But let's say there's a table on your web page, and somewhere in one field, some row and column there, that field you want to check. Well, that field in a table typically doesn't have an ID, doesn't have a name. The tag is the same, it's table for everyone. So the only way to get to that table is with an XPath expression. So there are certain places on your web page, depending how your page is written, that you cannot access with tag name and attribute or ID or name or whatever, and then your last resort is XPath. So you prefer ID first, then the name, then the CSS selector, and then XPath. XPath is your last option. It's also slow and it is brittle. If the structure of your web page changes, your XPath is not correct anymore. So all your tests that use that XPath expression has to change. That's why this is your last option, but sometimes that's all you can do. If you're out of luck and your web page that you have to test doesn't have IDs and names and all that stuff, you have to work with Expat. So now we know about locators. Now we're going to look at how these different user interface controls, how do we program? What's the API? So the simplest ones are input fields. So I have an input field, type is text, name is first name. Input field, type is text, name is last name. So what I do, I say driver find element by name first name, and that gets me back the web element. I call it first name, and I say first name send keys Frank. That's how you enter text into it. Then the same I do with last name, and then I can write my assert. Assert that first name get attribute value is Frank. So if you want to know the value of an input field, it's always web element.getAttribute value. That returns the text that is entered in that text field, in that input field. I can also say firstname.clear. That makes the field empty again. And I can have here my assert that that field is indeed empty. So find element, send keys, and then if you have the web element, so the web element you can say send keys, you can say get attribute value, you can say clear. Then, so here I have a text field and I put in there the value 20.2. So here, driver find element by ID text, there's an ID text, and assert that text.getText is 20.2. So what's the difference? This one is an input field. The user typically enters text. If I want the text of an input field, I need web element dot get attribute value. If I want the text on a text field, so the label, this is a label here, this is not an input field, it's just a label, some text on a web page, then you say web element dot get text. So there's a difference. If it's a label, plain text, you say web element dot text. If it is an input field, you say web element dot get attribute value. Then we have buttons. So here my button here, input, ID is submit button, type is submit, value is submit. So web element, driver find element by ID submit button. So now I have my button. What can you do? Click. Button.click. You can also say button.submit, and that goes maybe too deeply now, but in a web page, if you have a form, so that's what I have here, it's a form, then whenever I press this button, then the type here, it's a submit button. That means when I press this button, what the browser will do, it creates an HTTP request. In that HTTP request, it puts the first name with the value that I typed in, Frank. It puts in an attribute last name with the value Brown, and it sends it to the URL. I didn't specify a URL here, but it sends it to a certain URL. It's a submit button. So if you say button.submit, that only works if it is really a submit button in a certain form. You submit the form. But click is also fine, click. Then drop-down lists and list boxes. Well, that's a select. You select, you give it an ID or a name or whatever, and then you have options. With the options you can choose in your drop-down or list box. Well, the drop-down and list box for all the other attributes, for all the other elements on a web page, you get a web element. If you work with a drop down or a list box, you want to work with a select. So here I use web elements. Typically I use it for all elements on my web page, with the exception for the select here. So I call it a select. So I do the same. Select is new select, driver find element by ID my select. That's the ID. So driver find element by ID just returns the web element, and then I create a select class for that. Create a select class on that web element. Why that select? Is on that select there are specific methods that are only valid for a select, so for a drop down or a list box. One of them is select by visible text here. Select, so the visible text is here France, Italy and Spain. And here you just select one of the options that you have. Like you simulate basically, like the user clicks that Italy option. And you can also say, get first selected option. Give me the selected option. And in this case, that should be Italy. So that's the difference. These methods, select by visible text, get first selected option, and many other methods are methods of a select class. So here, for example, I say drop down select by visible text Italy. You can also say select by index to. So this is index to. Select by value option to. It's this value here. So there are three ways to select Italy. You can also say deselect all, deselect by visible text, deselect by index, deselect by value. You can also say drop down get options, give me all the options. I loop over them and I print that text. So this will print France, Italy and Spain. Multiple select drop down and list boxes. So here I get the selects. I say select by visible text France, select by index to, that's Spain. So now I selected France and Spain. And I get here get all selected options. So in the previous one, get options, it gives me all the options. This is get all selected options. And then I get back France and Spain. Radio buttons, checkboxes. So here I have a number of checkboxes here. And I give them all the same, they all have a different name. So option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4. That's typically what you do with checkboxes. Radio buttons, you typically group them by name. So in this case, these three radio buttons, programming, testing and test, have all the same name. That means there's only one radio button that you can select. If I select programming, then the other ones are not selected. If programming is selected and I select testing, then programming goes unselected and then testing is selected. There's only one that you can select. It's a group of radio buttons. So here what I say is driver find element by name option 1. So that's this Java checkbox. And I say language checkbox.click. So Java will now be selected. Then I do my test, get attribute value. So again, give me the value of that attribute and it should be Java. So it's the value here of the attribute. And I check it should be is selected. It should be displayed. It should also be enabled. Here I say find element by XPath. Here I use an XPath where I have input with the attribute testing, values testing. That's this one here. So it's this radio button. That's XPath is the selector of that radio button. And then I click it. So then testing will be selected, and then I say the attribute value should be testing and it should be selected. So again, you program what you want to do on your web page. Here's some more, go over that. Tables. So here I have my tables in a simple table, but now I want to test that in the first cell of my table I have the text cell 1. But you see here, there's no ID or it's very difficult to get to this cell 1. Actually, the only way to do that is with an XPath. So we've seen how to get the XPath. So here I have a locator by XPath. Basically, I start with table, it's this one. Then I go to the body, it's this one. Then I go to the first TR tag, it's this element with this tag. And then give me the first TD tag. That's this one here. And I ask for that field, give me the text, and that should be cell 1. It's similar I do for cell 4 here. So you have to know, say, if you program this in a project, then maybe the first day you have to look up in the API documentation, how do I do this, how do that, or you Google. But after a few days you get used to it and okay, this is also get, there's always get text, there's always this, it's always click. Once you do it a little bit, then you get used to this. You can also do all kinds of actions, browser actions. Driver.navigate refresh, that's basically click the refresh button of your browser, or the forward button or the backward button. You can also maximize your window. You can set your window to a certain dimension, the size of your window. All kinds of things you can do.